Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. We are doing today my updated top 10 list of my favourite series of all time. This is for March 2022, so a long-awaited update to show you what my favourite series are. A few little rules for this. These are series that I am generally caught up on. There aren't anywhere there are books left to read for me. As well as that, I am only going with one series per author. So there are some series that are going to miss out here due to that rule as well. All these series are speculative fiction. The vast majority are fantasy. There are a few science fiction series in here as well. Without any further ado, let's jump in with number 10. So in at number 10 is The Greatcoats by Sébastien de Castell. This is a 4-book series following Falcio Valmont and Brasti and Kest. They are travelling magistrates who go across the land trying to enforce and adjudicate the king's justice in Tristia. I really enjoy this. This is very much a swashbuckling adventure. This is all about Falcio, his relationship with his friends and fellow greatcoats, as well as his relationship with the king. It's very interesting. There is a lot of twists and turns, and it is pure swashbuckling fantasy. Epic speeches, heroic moments, and just really well done by Sébastien de Castell. This year I did get the opportunity to have an interview with him on Alan's channel, and it was absolutely wonderful to talk his writing process, talk spoilery things about the Greatcoats as well, and I absolutely love this series. It's really just a very fun and enjoyable fantasy adventure with swashbuckling and epic speeches, and something that I really enjoyed this year. In at number 9 is the Dogs of War series by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This currently has 2 books out in it, Dogs of War and then the follow-up Barehead. This was really difficult for me to decide because I've read so much Tchaikovsky this last year and there's so much of it that I really love. You may see more Tchaikovsky in the honourable mentions coming a little bit later, but Dogs of War for me was a brilliant set of books. I love the more personal take on science fiction that we get from Tchaikovsky here as we follow Rex, who is a bioform, so he's a sentient, sapient dog essentially who is being used by the military, and he and his group of other bioforms are commanded by their human owners and their masters, and it is about them realizing what is going on, gaining some form of consciousness and conscience and sapience, and it is done very well. It has a much more personal bent on science fiction than some of Tchaikovsky's other works, but I think it was just done exceedingly well. Book 2 takes a very different approach. It comes from a different character's viewpoint, and it is still very good, addressing the same kind of issues from that personal standpoint once again. And as far as science fiction goes, I think this is a really strong entry into Tchaikovsky's repertoire, particularly considering how short both of these books are, considering some of the door stoppers you get in science fiction. These really did move along at a pace and really address themes very well. Tchaikovsky is absolutely one of my favourite authors because he is so unbelievably consistent with his work, but for me this duology so far is some of his better stuff. In at number 8 is my favourite science fiction series at the moment, and this is the TX Kalan duology written by Arkady Martin. So that's A Memory Called Empire, and then its follow-up, A Desolation Called Peace. As a quick entry to this series, we are following Mahit, who is an ambassador for a small mining colony on the edge of a big empire, the TX Kalan Empire, and she is sent as an ambassador to replace their ambassador that has recently become deceased, and she is there trying to continue to build relations with this empire, also trying to work out what actually happened to the previous ambassador, and we follow her as she meets and greets many new people in this completely foreign culture to her. Is very interesting in terms of its themes of language and translation and how it goes about doing that, as well as being in a different culture. Now I think Arkady Martin writes these books exceedingly well. I think the mystery plot in A Memory Called Empire is very good as well, and I think along with a lot of science fiction I like, this has a really good ability to deal with themes and to give us a chance to consider things from a new perspective, and it's done very well. I believe that A Desolation Called Peace is not quite as strong as A Memory Called Empire, but I did give both of them 5 stars. A Desolation Called Peace felt a lot less focused on theme and a lot more focused on character and developing character relationships that we had seen initiated and started in A Memory Called Empire. I think it was a very good follow-up, and it pivoted well into a slightly different style while still maintaining a load of the things we loved from A Memory Called Empire. This is my favourite science fiction series, and you might tell from that that going forward we're into fantasy as my next set of series. So in at number 7 is a fantasy series that I absolutely adore. This is by Nicholas Ames and it's the Band series. There are currently 2 books out in this series, so that is Kings of the Wild and Bloody Rose. And I love both of these books for what they do in their own interesting and distinct ways. Kings of the Wild is about Slowhand Clay Cooper, who is an old mercenary who is trying to get the band back together. His band of mercenaries who were big names back in the day. They are famous like an 80s rock band are famous. And that's how these mercenary bands are set up. They very much ape 80s band culture, and they are super famous and known throughout the whole realm. And we are following Clay as him and the frontman, the leader of their mercenary band, Gabe, Golden Gabe, go about trying to find and rescue Gabe's daughter, who is caught in the middle of a siege. She has been forming her own band. She's trying to win her own renown and get out of the shadow of her father, and it's down to Clay and Gabe and the rest of the band to go and save her. This is a hilarious D&D style romp. If the humour doesn't work for you, the book probably won't work for you, but I was pleasantly surprised with how this took a turn as well. Kings of the Wild started out as all about comedy and humour and lightheartedness, and about the 3/4 point, I loved the turn, I loved the pivot. It became still funny, still lighthearted, but a little bit more serious. There was actually emotional beats there that I really enjoyed, and that continues on in Bloody Rose. Bloody Rose starts a little bit more serious, although in the same wacky D&D style world, but we have much more serious themes being introduced, whether that be depression, whether that be substance abuse, whether that be sort of dealing with fame. It's done very, very well, and I love the way that Nicholas Ames has managed to take this series and evolve it as it goes. I am super excited for book 3 whenever that comes out. I don't think it's particularly on the horizon, but this was a brilliant series for me because it was fun, it was quirky, it was really lighthearted, yet it still packed an emotional punch. And that's such a big deal for me in my fantasy series. So then moving on to number 6, and this is a series that is just missed out on the top 5, and it's a series that I've literally only just finished, and that is the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. Now I know loads of guys love this trilogy so much, and so do I. I think it's great. I gave every single book in these 5 stars. I absolutely love the way that Abercrombie writes. I think his prose is incredible. I think that the way he writes character is insanely good as well. The only reason this isn't higher on this list is the fact that it's really quite depressing. I found the ending of Last Argument of Kings in particular to be very down, and it's not what I normally like in my fantasy, to be that dour and dark and bleak and hopeless. I think Abercrombie does it insanely well. I think he does a very good job at doing that, and if that's what you want, if you want this grimdark feel, then this series will absolutely be for you. And you'll see this is the singular grimdark series on this list, and I really thought it was done very well, but definitely not something that I want huge quantities of. I wouldn't want to make this my regular style of reading because I think I would become very dejected reading this kind of thing all the time, but as a lovely little insert in between classic epic fantasy series, it was definitely enjoyable, and I think it really does make me question some things about the human condition as we think about what it is to change, what it is to grow. Can people change? How can that come about? There are lots of things to think about here, and to be honest, in another year's time when I do this list again, this could be a lot higher, because I feel like I might not stop thinking about this for the next 12 months. There was a lot to process, a lot to think about. It's in at number 6, but I have only finished it this week, so we'll see where that settles out in the future as well. And then we're into my top 5, and at number 5 is The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne. Here is my copy of Malice. I really love John Gwynne's writing. The Faithful and the Fallen is on here, and it's actually edged out some of Gwynne's other works, partially because it was my introduction to Gwynne, it was my introduction to the Banished Lands, which is where this is set, and because actually we've not completed the Bloodsworn saga yet, which would otherwise quite possibly be on this list instead. I really like Faithful and the Fallen. It takes a relatively standard farm boy chosen one-ish trope. It is pretty classic fantasy in that way, but it evolves it really, really nicely. The Banished Lands is a very Celtic-inspired setting. There's definitely some Roman influences as well, and I just really love that setting. It's not a unique setting in any sense, but I really like the Celtic inspiration. I love the small changes in creatures and mythical beings that we get in this world as well. I love the introduction of giants and how they are handled, and in so many ways I just really, really love the way the series is done. I love how fast-paced the chapters are, even if it's quite a slow build in the first book. I love the combat. John Gwynn's combat writing has always been incredible and continues to be as I read more and more of his books. It never feels like it's just there for action. It always advances characters and their relationships, and it's just done so very well. And in all honesty, this is so high because it includes one of my favourite characters in the entirety of fantasy. I absolutely adore Makeen, who we meet in some of the later books. I love him so much. I think his arc is just done magnificently. It's the kind of arc that I don't always love, but I think that John Gwynn writes it so incredibly well. I just adore Makeen as a character, and that will be why this series continues to be high on these lists for many years to come, because he is just written so exquisitely well, and I love the arc that John Gwynn gives him. Next up at number 4 might be a surprise for you guys if you have been long-time followers of my channel, and that's because it is The Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time, that was number 1 last year, is down to number 4 in this list in 2022. Now, let me explain why that is. That's not because I love The Wheel of Time any less. That's not because I didn't enjoy the show. That's not because of any of that really. It's just because I have realised how much I love some of these other series that I am involved in. How I absolutely adore so many series. And actually, The Wheel of Time, when I last did this list, I had just finished it like a couple of months before. And that had taken such a huge chunk of my year. It had taken such a huge chunk of my reading time and my focus and my thought that I was just so ingrained in this world. And actually, having considered it more, having read more things, there are other things that I love just as much that don't take as much page time to do what they're doing. And I think that is really the big detracting thing for The Wheel of Time, is that it has so many pages and a lot of them don't really serve the plot that well. Now, the plot isn't necessarily the reason I love The Wheel of Time anyway. I love the setting. The setting and the way that Robert Jordan explores it is why I love this series so much. The character growth is just astounding. And yes, he has 14 books and a novella. Not really a novella, it's novel length. But he has 15 books to build those character arcs and build that character growth. So yes, it should be good, but it is awesome. It is some of the best character growth, possibly the best character growth I have ever read. And it is just done so insanely well. I love the setup and the build throughout these books. And I just think, considering how long ago this was started, it is a very up with the times fantasy series. There are still elements that aren't great. There are still elements that people don't love and I don't love. But for the world and for the character growth, this has to be in my top 5. I just love it so very much. Moving on to number 3, and this is going to include one of the authors from the previous entry, and that is The Cosmere from Brandon Sanderson. Yes, I am counting The Cosmere as an entire series in and of itself. I'm not going to split up Stormlight. I'm not going to split up Mistborn. It is a shared universe, and in my opinion, totally reasonable and worthwhile to keep it all together as one series in this list. For those of you who have been living under a rock, The Cosmere is this shared universe by Brandon Sanderson, where each of these series is set on a different world with different magic systems, but they are interrelated and they are moving through time. As Brandon continues to write these series, we'll be moving into sort of later and later ages in The Cosmere. We're going to see how things have developed and how these planets may start to interact. And I just think that is really fascinating. I love this idea of a shared universe, and the individual series I think are done so very well. The original Mistborn Era 1 trilogy has one of my favourite endings of a series ever. I absolutely adore the bittersweet ending we get at the end of Mistborn. It is what I love in fantasy, is those feels of sadness and grief and hope and joy and elation, and it's done so extremely well. It is one of my favourite, probably my favourite ending to a series ever. Stormlight Archive, need I say more? You'll have heard of it. It is a really strong, epic series. I know a lot of people think it gets better. I love The Way of Kings though. The first book in this series is done so very well. I love that underdog story, that almost sports underdog story that we get in film so often, I think is done very well translated over to a fantasy setting. Yes, it's probably overly wordy, and yes, that makes sense when Brandon Sanderson is coming from the Robert Jordan school of fantasy writing. Yes, it is going to be wordy, but I think that Brandon has actually shown an ability to be more concise in the later books in the Mistborn Era 2 series, as well as in Warbreaker in particular. It's like a 600-700 page book, and it's done so much more concisely, and it is possibly my favourite book in the whole Cosmere. So Brandon is showing that ability to be more concise and to really convey things in an easier to digest manner. And I'm just really excited to be part of reading the Cosmere as it comes out. It's a very exciting experience to be involved with other fans who are reading it at the same time and not reading something way after the fact like I did with The Wheel of Time. So now we move on to number two on this list. And this is a series I read in 2021. It is very much shorter than a lot of these series on this list, and that is The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. I really, really love this series. This series was incredible. It is one of the series I continue to think about super regularly. The way that Daniel Abraham addresses themes of identity, national pride, what it is to grieve, the way that he deals with this relationship of two and more people over decades and decades. We go from following these characters when they're 14 or 15 up to when they're 70. And it does all of that in like 1,400 pages, which is just absolutely astounding. It has some of the biggest emotional beats that I have read in fantasy. It is slow. It is slow. So it's a Eastern inspired setting, and it is very much a slow and thoughtful approach to fantasy. It doesn't have blockbuster action scenes. In fact, in the first book, In a Shadow in Summer, I don't think there is something you could really class as an action scene, but it is thoughtful and it is thought-provoking, and it is something to engage with your thoughts and your emotions, and I think it's just so well done. This series has jumped up my list from last year because I've not stopped thinking about it, and for Daniel Abraham to get me in that mindset and to get me to think that much about something with so few pages is just absolutely astounding to me, and that is something that even Robert Jordan wouldn't do. He couldn't be as concise as that. He couldn't convey these themes and these thoughts and these emotions as concisely as Daniel Abraham has here in The Long Price Quartet. It is just a beautiful, beautiful story, and I cannot recommend it highly enough, as long as you can cope without it being super action focused. Now, before we talk about number one, I want to go through some honourable mentions, so series that didn't quite make this list for whatever reason. So two of these series that would be in the 11 and 12 spot would have been the Winnowing Flame Trilogy by Jen Williams. I love that series. I think it was done exceedingly well. The second book slowed down a little, but book 3 really had one of those amazing bittersweet endings that I was talking about with Mistborn. I really, really adored it. Although I don't think I'm ever actually going to forgive Jen Williams for how she ended that series, to be honest. Another one in this list would be The Memoirs of Lady Trent by Marie Brennan. This is a series that I was super not excited for after having read book 1. I think I gave it 3.5 stars for A Natural History of Dragons. And yet by the end of book 3, I was really enjoying it. I love the different style of fantasy that we get here. It's like Victorian-esque fantasy, and it's about culture and society and dealing with cultural norms and being in different cultures and navigating them, as well as dragons. What's not to like? There are also a couple of series that didn't make this list because I love the author too much and I've put a different series on this list. So they would include the Children of Time series by Adrian Tchaikovsky, so Children of Time and Children of Ruin. This is a sci-fi epic, an award-winning sci-fi epic series that is just incredible. It is much more concept focused than the Dogs of War series, and they're just different, but I love them both equally. It's really hard to pick one over another, and for me, I went with the Dogs of War series, but Children of Time and Children of Ruin are incredible. If you've not read them and you love sort of high concept science fiction, you should absolutely give them a read. As well as that, books by John Gwynne, so Blood and Bone, that trilogy that follows on from The Faithful and the Fallen, and as well as that, we have the Bloodsworn Saga, Shadow of the Gods, and now The Hunger of the Gods, which I'm currently reading. That is there because I've not read enough of them yet. When the third one comes out, when I finish book 2, I'll have a stronger opinion on it. But for right now, Faithful and the Fallen still wins out for John Gwynne. And my other honourable mention is the Codex Alera series by Jim Butcher. I am currently 4.5 books through this 6-book series, so it can't quite make this list yet. But let's jump into number 1. My favourite series currently in speculative fiction, and that is going to be The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. Now, that is no surprise if you followed this channel for a little while. I have been doing my umpteenth reread or re-listen of the Dresden Files recently. I've just finished Small Favour, and I have realised on this reread that even the books that I think are weaker, I'm still giving 5 stars. Now, if in a 17-book series there is a book that I think is weaker and I am giving it 4.5 or 5 stars, and the ones I love are like just the best books I've ever read, that series can't not be at number 1. And that does make an interesting thing here, that the only urban fantasy on this list is number 1 on this list. I don't really do urban fantasy, yet I absolutely love the Dresden Files. I love what Jim Butcher does with it. I love on this reread how he is sprinkling things in books and books and books before they come to fruition, so that we can see how they're developing, and we can see how he's developing this plot and how these characters are growing over this series. This is the series that got me back into reading fantasy, got me back into reading really, and I just absolutely adore it. I cannot give enough praise to the Dresden Files. For those of you who've tried the first few books and didn't think it was amazing, I would recommend keeping going. I think that it really kicks off book 4 or 5. Book 7 is like the proper kick-off fireworks start to the series, and from then on it is just better and better and better. I absolutely adore this series. I think the world building is incredible for an urban fantasy. It takes myths and legends and creatures from folklore and it weaves them all together into this wonderful world. For those of you who don't know, it is following Harry Dresden, who is a wizard, who is also a private detective, and he is in the phone book under wizard, and he's a practicing wizard, and people come to him with jobs. He also works heavily for the Chicago Police Department as well, and that's sort of the basis of those first few books. We get to follow him as he is following and trying to solve cases, and it is just, it grows as Jim Butcher grows as an author. The first few books are definitely weaker, but the more recent entries in the series are just absolutely banger after banger after banger. I cannot contain my excitement for how good the Dresden Files is. If you haven't read it, I highly, highly recommend it. It is just a wonderful, wonderful series. I hope that's been interesting. Do let me know down below your top few favourite series of all time. What are these series that you love and you will gush about and you will recommend to everybody? And if you want to see more of my content, there should be another video to go and view up here, and I'll see you guys again soon.